Welcome, welcome, welcome. If you are looking for the latest information on the ACT and the SAT and how to use those exams to position your student for success in the college admissions process, you've come to the right place. Now, one thing that we keep hearing from parents and students alike right now is that they are experiencing information overload. It feels like they are drinking out of a fire hose when they're trying to figure out how the ACT and SAT are being used by colleges and then what steps they need to take to effectively use those tools to position themselves for success in this process. What I want to encourage everybody to do today is to take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. We're going to go through this step by step and make this easy for you. There's a lot on the line, of course. There are a number of steps that you need to take in order to put yourself in a position where these colleges are going to say yes when you apply to them. But there is a process, right? And if we know what to do, and if we create a plan with thoughtfulness and intention, and then we go about executing that plan, good things are going to happen. Now, if we're going to create a plan with intention on how to move through this process, we need to ask the right questions. Now, there's a question I hear a lot these days. Nick, do I have to take an ACT or an SAT? Well, there are a lot of things in this process that you don't have to do. You don't have to put forth maximal effort in your high school classes. You don't have to try to earn as many A's as possible. You don't have to take that AP class that you're thinking about taking next year. There are a lot of things you don't have to do. So I don't really find that to be a very helpful question. It's a bit of a waste of time on what do I have to do. What I want to focus on is what can I do to reach my goals for the future? And so let's start with that question. What are my goals for the future? Who do I want to become in the world? What are things I want to go do in the world? And I want to look long term. I want to look way past college. Who do I want to be and what do I want to do? And even if you don't have specific answers, these are still great questions to ask because everyone is interested in something. Everyone can get excited about something. And if we keep digging and keep asking that question, we'll arrive at some idea of who we want to be and where we want to go. And will that change in the future? Of course it will. But having some goals for the future now will help dictate our current actions and give meaning to this process so that we're no longer asking, what do I have to do? But what can I do to reach my goals for the future? And this is the type of stuff I get really excited about over the course of this whole process. So once we look at what are my goals for the future, then we need to ask the question, will going to college help me become that person and do those things I want to do out in the world? And it's important here for parents and students to be open to a range of answers. Maybe the answer is yes, college will help me to reach my goals for the future. Maybe it's no. Whatever those answers are, we cannot have predetermined conclusions. We need to come into this process, discuss it, parent and student together, and be open to whatever answers the student comes up with and have a real honest and open conversation about it. If the answer is yes, college is going to help me to reach my goals for the future, well, then we start to look at what specific colleges would help you, the student, reach those goals for the future. Now we're starting to narrow down our list, right? If a student wants to be a surgeon someday, well, maybe they want to take a look at the pre-med program at Johns Hopkins. And you can see how it starts to work backwards. Because if we're going to apply pre-med to Johns Hopkins, we probably want to take that AP Bio class to become a stronger applicant when we apply. If the student says they want to design video games someday, well, then we want to look at what colleges have the best video game design programs, and we can work backwards from that. Once we've answered those questions, we finally get down to, will an ACT or an SAT score help me get into those colleges that are going to help propel me towards my goals for the future? So you can see that we don't necessarily start with the ACT and the SAT. We flip this on its head and we work backwards towards what's going to help me reach my long-term goals for the future. We do need to acknowledge some realities that are going on in the college admissions process. But before I do that, before I dig into these stats, I want to make sure to say this first. If you're listening to this webinar, then it's highly likely you have the time and resources to be intentional about this process. And what that tells me is you are a student who, if you want to go to college, you're going to find your way to one of the 2,000 plus four-year colleges out there. If you want to go to college, you will go to college. So let's take that little piece of anxiety off the table for students that think they may not get in anywhere. That's not really true. There are plenty of companies that use fear-mongering along those lines to get you to hire them for something or the other. But it's not actually true. If you want to go to college, you will, and there are many right fit colleges out there for you. At the same time, while that exists, we have what we call selective colleges, and those are students that admit fewer than 50% of the students that apply to them. And one thing that's interesting is that these days, we have more and more students applying to the same top 100 selective schools. And so as you can see on this graph here, we've got in gray, we've got applications in 2020, and then in red, we've got applications in 2021. And you can see that applications went up from 2020 to the 2021 cycle. And as applications go up, it means these admission rates continue to go down. And this isn't to stir up anxiety. The intention here is that I want to acknowledge the reality of how competitive it has become at that particular group of schools. But it's important that we look at this and examine this, because when it comes to ACT and SAT scores, they play an outsized role at those more competitive colleges. And typically the families that are asking me for advice are at least somewhat, if not very interested in those selective colleges. So we're going to spend some time looking at those today and examining the data coming out of those colleges so we can understand how you can best position yourself to gain admittance to those schools. Before we go any further, I'd like to just offer an overview of how the college admissions process works, and then we'll dig into specifically the new role that the ACT and SAT play in that process. So we've got three parts to the admissions application. The numbers, or as it's referred to in admissions parlance, the academic standards, which basically consists of the transcript. Those are going to be your grades. And then they really do take a look at the course rigor, which just means the difficulty level of the classes that you took. And so those two things are looked at in combination, right? It's the grades you earned, but in the context of how challenging the courses were that you took. And I think this can best be understood with an example. If a student says they want to be pre-med at Johns Hopkins someday, well, that college admissions officer that's examining the student's file, they're going to look and say, hey, it's great that this kid earned an A in biology, but did the student take that extra step to challenge himself or herself in AP biology, since that's what they say they want to study in college? So this isn't to say that students need to take every AP class under the sun, but it is very helpful to take those more challenging courses that line up with where the subjects that the student is most interested in high school. Now, the other piece of the academic standards is that ACT or SAT score. And again, this isn't used in isolation. Nobody's looking at the score and saying, oh, that student earned a 33 on the ACT or a 1500 on the SAT. That's all we need to know. They're taking that score and using it in conjunction with the grades to get an overall picture of how well they think that student will perform at a given college. Now, college admissions officers do know that the ACT and the SAT are not great indicators of intelligence. They are not great indicators of a student's capacity for the future. But what they have been proven to do is be great predictors of grades during your freshman year of college and grades over the 4 years that you are in college, and then graduation rates from college. And that's why colleges continue to find them useful, even though they know it does not give any deep insights into a particular student as a person or what they might go and achieve someday in the future. Now, if you get past that first round of examination, then they get into the qualitative pieces of the application. We're going to be looking at the essays, the extracurriculars that student was involved in, and then letters of recommendation from some adults, probably a school counselor or a teacher that student formed a relationship with. And hopefully all these pieces of the story tie in together to tell what we like to call a coherent narrative about that student. They give that college admissions officer a real idea of not just achievements that student has had in their life, but an idea of who they are, how they think, and what they might be able to bring to that college campus, to the community that exists at that college. And then the last piece is going to be fit. Right? We want to have the right fit between student and college. And that comes in a lot of different forms. It might be, you should be thinking about all this though, as you're putting together a list of colleges to apply to in terms of the geographic area of the country that you want to be in. Do you want to attend a large school, a small school? Is it important for you to attend big Division I football games, or would you rather be in tiny classes that maybe there's only 8 other students in and you really get to know your professors on a personal basis? We've got to weigh up all these things when we're looking at different colleges and putting together that list to make sure that it aligns with the fit that we're looking for. And the last thing I'm going to say on this is, a lot of the time people don't think about finances as part of the fit, but you absolutely should. As we dig into this, ACT and SAT scores are often tied to merit-based scholarships. And this can be life-changing amounts of money. I mean, it really does change a student's life when they graduate from college debt-free. And so don't neglect the finances when we're looking at fit at various schools. Let's define our terms in regards to testing these days. We've got some schools still require an ACT or an SAT. And then the terms that cause confusion are test optional versus test blind. So test optional means you have the option of sending in a score, but it's not required. In other words, it can bolster your application if you choose to send it, and it paints you in a positive light academically. Test blind is what it sounds like. A college refuses to look at those scores even if you send them to them. Now, I'd like to ask a question. What percent of colleges out there right now do you think are test optional? I'll give you a little hint with this pie chart up on the screen. And you can see a big slice are test optional. Now, right now, we've got less than 9% of colleges are test blind. It's mainly the Cal States in California and the UCs in California. This means over 90% of colleges either require ACT and SAT, or they accept one of those exams through their test optional policy. Right now, the number of schools requiring them is 5.8%. So that is a small percentage, mostly located in Florida and Georgia. But as you can see, the vast majority of colleges are test optional, meaning they will accept a score if you send one. So our next big question is, if you choose to send in a score to these test optional schools, does it actually help? Let's look at data coming directly out of these colleges to answer that question. On this chart here, we're looking at applying with an ACT or an SAT score versus applying without one, and then the admission rates associated to each group, right? And these are colleges that have made this information public that fall into that selective category. So we've got Amherst, Boston, Colgate, Notre Dame, USC, Vanderbilt, and Wellesley. And as you can see here, I mean, big picture, the red bars are higher than the gray bars, right? And the red bars are the students who submitted scores. And if we dig in a little deeper, some of the highlights, I mean, students are nearly twice as likely to be admitted to Notre Dame with an ACT or an SAT score than when they apply without one. If we look at a school like Colgate, little liberal arts school, we've got a 12% admission rate when applying without an ACT or an SAT, and then a 25% admission rate when applying with an ACT or an SAT. And then at Boston, we've got an admission rate of 14% without a score, and then students who did submit scores had an admission rate of 25%. So the data here really speaks for itself, which is to say that students who can perform well on these tests and submit scores are doing very well in the admissions process. Now, I know what some of you are asking right now, which is that, well, what if my starting score, I take a practice ACT or an SAT and I don't love the score and I don't think it's going to help me at these schools? We're going to dig into that question a little bit later in the presentation, but there's a few key pieces of information that I want you to have first before we answer that question. So inflation isn't only at the grocery store. We now see a resounding 55% of students that graduate high school with an A average. And if we look at this chart, we can see back in the 90s, this number was as low as 39%, and it has just inched up over time, currently at 55%, and with each year it ticking ever and ever higher. This becomes a real problem for colleges who are trying to differentiate between students. Because as more and more students are graduating with these elevated, some would say inflated GPAs, they need something else to set students apart. And that's where that ACT and SAT score come in, because those, which are graded on a bell curve, have a much smaller number of students each year that score at the top end of the scale. And that makes it easier to evaluate these students in a fair and transparent manner. Now, we all know standardized tests are bad, right? Everyone agrees on that. At the high school level, at the college level, certainly at the student level, standardized tests are bad. I don't particularly like them, even though I have spent 17 years preparing students for the ACT and the SAT. Here's the thing, not having them is actually worse. Right? Whenever we change something in a given process, there are unintended consequences. And that's what this little cartoon shows here. Let's look at some of those unintended consequences. As it turns out, some of the things we learned over the last two years is that personal essays and GPA are more predictive of family wealth than standardized tests are. So by removing standardized tests, because often the argument is given that these tests are unfair to students who come from low-income areas or go to underperforming high schools. However, if we replace those standardized tests with metrics like using the personal essay and the GPA and elevating those in the process, we're actually exacerbating the problem, because again, those two items are more predictive of family wealth than standardized tests are. Less than half of American high schools offer AP calculus. Why is this a problem? Well, if you are a student at an underperforming high school and you want to show your mathematical capability, you can't do that if your high school doesn't offer AP calculus. In contrast to that, the ACT and the SAT are accessible to be taken to any student out there, so they can show these colleges that they can hack it academically on their campuses. And this was one of the reasons that MIT highlighted when they announced that they were going to reinstitute the requirement for an ACT or an SAT score, is they found that removing it or even being test optional actually hurt students that come from the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And there are multiple studies that have highlighted this fact. Even the UC's in-depth, multi-year, meticulously researched study on SAT and ACT scores and their predictive capabilities showed that removing the test would hurt low-income students. Now, is it strange that the UCs have since gone test blind? Well, we're going to dig into that a little deeper a little further in the presentation, but the reason they removed those tests, just to give you the highlight here, is that they were actually sued for discrimination if they continued to use the tests, and part of their settlement is that they would be test blind for a number of years and not use those tests, even though it flew in the face of their own research and that's come out of various universities, that removing the exams actually decreases equity rather than increases it in the college admissions process. And what we've learned from all of this, to sum up, is that while no one in the entire education ecosphere likes the ACT or the SAT, it does provide balance. It provides a check. It's really the last bastion of merit in this process, because students can hire people to help them write their personal statements and spend hours and hours with a professional that can help them craft the perfect statement. We know that certainly at private schools, occasionally big donors put pressure on teachers to be nice to their students in this process. But there's nobody you can lean on for the ACT or the SAT. Even if you hire a professional ACT or SAT tutor, or if you're coming to Test Prep Gurus and you're hiring a whole group of people to come help your student one-on-one, an expert math and science teacher and an expert reading and English teacher to really boost those scores, at the end of the day, the student still has to put in the work. There is no way for that person to take the test for them, to tell them how to answer the questions. All they can do is help teach them how to prepare. And that's why these tests continue to play a very important role in this process and make it more fair and more transparent. To put a finer point on this, we can look at the statement that MIT released when they announced they were going to reinstate testing requirements. Standardized tests help us to identify socioeconomically disadvantaged students who lack access to advanced coursework that would demonstrate their readiness for MIT. And that comes straight from the Dean of Admissions at the top research institute in the world. So I definitely trust their conclusions in this process. In contrast to that, we've got the UCs and the Cal States, which have gone test blind. They dropped these tests, again, due to several lawsuits that were brought against them in the state of California. And it has created a little bit of an upside down world in admissions to the UCs as a result. One of the things that's happened is AP classes have risen in importance when applying to the UCs. So essentially they dropped the standardized tests and replaced them with more standardized tests. However, these AP exams are not available at all high schools. And so we took one that students had more access to and replaced it with tests that students have less access to. So I don't know that this is really helpful towards these less privileged groups. Interesting for our California families that are listening to this, the UC is really not doing people in California any favors. We now have students are 3.67 times more likely to get into UCI when they apply out of state versus the California residents. The more cynical people among us might think that that is the case because out of state students pay more in tuition than California residents do. However, California residents usually are not terribly happy with these findings since the UCs are primarily funded with California tax dollars, and the majority of state schools across the nation tend to favor their in-state residents rather than the opposite. Because when we look at this data, whether it's Irvine, San Diego, UCLA, Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, or Davis, they all are favoring out-of-state students by one degree to another, and oftentimes by a large margin. Berkeley is currently the one arm of the UC where we see a slightly higher admit rate for the California residents versus the out-of-state students. And this is nothing to say of the advantages that are given to international students because they tend to pay more than the out-of-state students. Now, when we look at other very selective colleges across the country, they are being much more forthright and honest about the role that test scores play, and they often talk about them in terms of optional but preferred, right? They want to have a test optional policy, one, because more students apply to their schools, but also so that they can admit students that show their strengths in different ways. However, for the bread and butter students, their typical applicants, we can learn a lot about how they're thinking when we look at what their admissions officers are saying. The dean of admissions at Yale, test scores are the single most effective factor in predicting a student's first year and four-year grade point average. Northwestern, while high school grades are a strong predictor for academic success in college, the combination of grades and standardized test scores has been shown to strengthen that prediction. We still find value in scores if you choose to send them. And colleges are not known for speaking very forcefully. And so when they make a nuanced statement like that, we still find value in those scores if you choose to send them. What they're saying is, if you can show us that you can do well on these tests, please send them to us. Another way that this was phrased from an admissions officer was when we looked at what the top guy at Duke had to say, where he said there were certainly some students where we wish we'd had scores and we didn't. And again, they want the process to be fair and transparent. And what they're saying is if we're looking at two students that have very similar GPAs, that have very similar resumes in terms of their leadership activities, strong essays, strong letters of recommendation, well, it might be the student, it used to be that a student who had a little bit higher score would stand out over the others, whereas now it's the student that doesn't have a score. They really have to be that much more excellent to stand out in this process over the students that do. And so it really behooves students to send in a score if you are able to do that. The other huge reason that families are motivated to prepare for tests, do well on them, and send them to colleges is that those ACT and SAT scores are still very strongly linked to merit-based scholarships. And to put that in perspective, the pool of money that's out there that gets talked about the most are need-based scholarships based on your family's financial aid profile. But the pool of money that exists in the need-based financial aid is about the same size as the merit-based pool of financial aid at various colleges. And merit-based financial aid is primarily based on GPA plus a standardized test score. And this previous year, we really saw this in action with very tangible results. So we had a number of students apply to TCU, but there were two that stood out to us where they were very similar on paper. And we saw both students got into TCU. However, one had a score, one did not. And the young woman that had a 31 on the ACT, she won a $112,000 scholarship to TCU. The student who did not have a score, that gentleman, while he did get into the school, he's basically paying full sticker price or paying for it with loans to go there. He wasn't given these scholarships that don't have to be paid back after he graduates, and that can make a big difference in a student's financial health and their associated mental health, and the parents as well when that student graduates from college. We saw very similar results at other colleges with other cohorts of students. In another example, a student won $144,000 to Chapman University here in Orange County. And this is a great example of how this student was going to be applying to other strong private universities in Southern California. And if you're Chapman, you know one of those schools is probably USC. Now, USC is ranked higher. It's a more popular school. They've got a football team, which does attract a lot of students. They want to attend those big events with lots of their fellow students. And so Chapman needs to do something to attract that student to choose Chapman over USC. And so this student with a 30 on the ACT, they said, hey, that's going to be a competitive score at both schools. The student will probably apply to those other schools that might be ranked higher than us. So Chapman says, what if we give you a lot of scholarship money? Would that entice you to come here? And this student did end up choosing to go to Chapman because USC did not offer much in the way of merit-based scholarships. And so this was a really positive outcome for this student, and I think points to a couple of things. One, the investment that a family might put into test preparation, which is going to be along the lines of in the hundreds of dollars for a classroom program or in the thousands of dollars for a one-on-one program, is oftentimes paid back by a factor of 2 or 5 or 10 or 20 in terms of the scholarship money that they win as a result of these programs. And I would note USC also has similar programs. Their trustee scholarship program is free tuition. Basically everything, all your educational expenses are paid for 4 years of schooling if you happen to win that very prestigious scholarship. And it's mostly based, again, on grades and then a standardized test score. There is a subsequent interview round and some personal statements that have to be submitted when we get down to the small group of students competing for them. But the biggest piece of it, again, are those grades and test scores. And then in the final example here, we had a student with a 1330 on the SAT just in this last admission cycle that was just concluded, who won $91,000 to SMU. What do I do next, right? This is the part that many of you have been waiting for, where we're going to go grade by grade and talk about next steps in this process. Now, before we do that, I want to make sure we understand the differences between the SAT and the ACT. I've got another question up there for you. Yes, for those of you who said that the SAT is graded on a scale of 400 to 1600, you were correct. We've got a verbal section, multiple sections, but they're totaled into the verbal score, which is scored from 200 to 800. And then we have multiple math sections that are then compiled into a score between 200 and 800. Those two scores are added together, and you have your total score that could be as high as 1600 on the SAT. Now let's ask another question. What is the scoring scale for the ACT? Yeah, and so the ACT is scaled from 1 to 36. It's a very different scale. I would note here that when you're looking at these two exams, so everyone feels really good when they move up 120 points on the SAT. I mean, that feels amazing, and you know that's going to make a big difference. Because the scoring scales are so different, improving your score 3 points on the ACT is roughly equal to moving up 120 points on the SAT. So even though that raw number is smaller, each point on the ACT is a really big deal. And so if you do end up preparing for these exams, just remember that in the future, that each point you move up makes a big difference in this process. Now, there's 4 sections on the ACT as opposed to 2 on the SAT. We've got a reading section. We all know what critical reading looks like. There's a writing section, which is basically looking at grammar and clarity and coherency in writing, a math section, and a science section. Each one of those sections is scaled on ranges from 1 to 36. And then rather than adding up the scores, the ACT averages those 4 scores together to give you a final total score, or in their case, they call it the composite score from 1 to 36. Last note on the 2 tests. Students are often a little nervous when they take a practice exam for the ACT and they see the science section for the first time, because it is unlike anything that's found on either test. And it's probably unlike anything you've seen in school. Contrary to popular belief, it does not test a lot of science-based knowledge. It's not really looking at what did you learn in your biology, chemistry, and physics courses. It's much more about interpreting information visually when it's depicted in charts and graphs and experiments, and then drawing conclusions from those experiments and those charts and graphs. The first time a student takes a practice exam for the ACT, we expect them to run out of time on that section because they're just not familiar with it. And it can be off-putting to students, and they think, I'll never be able to get good at this. I would like to tell you here and now, the science section of the ACT is one of the sections we see the largest increases on, because when you work with a professional teacher who can really guide you through the ins and outs of that section and teach you how to attack it quickly and draw those conclusions correctly and with speed, well, students really excel on that section. So don't be put off by the abnormal format of that science section. My 7th graders, 8th graders, 9th graders, I've got a secret for you that is going to make you a better student. It's going to make you a more interesting person. It's going to stimulate your brain. And then as a side product, it's also going to help you on standardized tests when you get a little bit older. You ready for it? Here it is. Read for pleasure. That's all I want these younger students to do. Read for pleasure outside of what's required in school. We ran a multi-year study on the variables that help students eventually achieve high scores in these tests. And to our surprise, reading for pleasure leapt out from the data as a real standout. And part of the reason for that is the critical reading sections that are found on standardized tests. Those are challenging sections to improve your score on if you're a student that doesn't read a lot. It's not that you can't do it. It's just going to take longer, and you're going to need to put more energy into that process. But for those younger families on this call, I want to give you this trick ahead of time. For that student that reads for pleasure, essentially with the critical reading section, you're learning to read faster for a higher level of retention. And students that read a lot, it's easier for them to internalize those skills. 10th grade. All right, this is when it starts to get serious. So in October of 10th grade, you're going to take the PSAT. If it is offered at your high school, definitely sign up for it. The PSAT in and of itself is not going to impact your college admissions process in any sort of negative fashion. If you don't want anyone to ever know about your PSAT score, no one's ever going to know about it. It's just a nice dry run. You've got to get your pencils, you got to get your calculator, you've got to get ready for it and go take that test. If you happen to do really well on it and end up scoring in the, it's even higher than just the top 1% of all test takers, you might find yourself eligible for a national merit scholarship. And so that's the only case where colleges will find out about your PSAT score. And if they happen to find out about it because of that, well, then it's going to be a huge bonus for your applications, and it's never a negative in this process. You're going to take a mock ACT in the winter or spring of 10th grade. And the reason we do that is we want to see which test you're naturally a little bit better at. And that brings us to step 3. We're going to compare those two scores and then choose which test is best for you. There is no college out there, test optional or not, that wants you to send them an ACT score and an SAT score. So it really makes sense for each individual student to just focus on which test are you best at, put your energy into preparing for that exam only, and then submit that score to those colleges. And if anyone needs a free mock SAT, ACT, or PSAT exam, and for that matter, an HSPT or an ISEE exam or an SSAT, if there's a standardized exam out there that you want to take, let us know, and we'll do everything we can to make that happen for you. We do that for free for anybody that wants it. It's one of the ways, it's part of our equity pledge to make all of this accessible to as many families as we can, because we want to help as many students be as successful as possible in this process. And so if anybody needs a free test, contact us there. Let us know which exams you're looking for. You can take those free mock exams online in the comfort of your own home, or if you happen to live near one of our numerous in-person preparation centers, you can come in and take that test in person. So again, just reach out and we can give you all of that information. Somebody will call you back or email you back with the info you need and get you set up with those free tests. Now, the summer before 11th grade is a really important time. Before we've reached the summer, ideally you would have taken your PSAT or a full-length mock SAT, and then a full-length mock ACT or a pre-ACT. So we've already decided if SAT or ACT is better for you as a student. Then in this summer before 11th grade, call us, talk to us, or work with your counselor, whether that's your high school counselor or private counselor, and look at test dates during your junior year, the very beginning of your senior year. Let's plot backwards from those, from a few official test dates that make sense for you as a student, right? Because we're going to try to plot out 3 official exams. Hopefully you only need to take the test twice. Some very lucky students only need to take it once, but we still, at the beginning of this process, we want to plot out 3 dates for official exams. It does a couple of things. One, we have a plan for the whole way through, and we know when things are going to happen, and that helps us to make good decisions along the way. 2, it takes the anxiety level down on each individual sitting for the test if a student knows they've got another crack at it down the line. So this is really the smartest way to set this up. We want to create an intentional plan to help that student reach their goals. And this really applies to the standardized testing piece of this. So feel free to reach out to our staff after you've taken your mock exams. We'll talk to anyone, whether it's over the phone, a Zoom call, or in person, and take 15 minutes to help you plot a plan for success. And if that happens to involve working with us from a prep standpoint, great. But either way, we're here to help you as a family. And then again, if you need that mock ACT or SAT to get started, there's that link again. Some parents always want to know when they get their practice test results back, what's a good score? Well, at Test Prep Gurus, we like to say there are no good or bad scores. There are only scores that are going to help you reach your goals for the future. Keep in mind throughout this process, these tests are not intelligence tests. They don't tell anyone anything of value about you as a person. They're simply stepping stones to get where you want to go in the future. Now, along those lines, we have created this flyer, and there should be a link on your screen to download that lists the typical scores for students who are admitted to the top 100 most popular colleges. And this is the full, you need to download the full flyer to see all of the scores, but this is a close-up right here of one little piece of the flyer. And what we can see is if a student scores, let's say a 28, that's going to put them in this range at Occidental where they're in the range of students who are typically admitted. And if you scroll down a little bit, let's say they're also interested in Pitzer College. Well, that 28 is a little bit below that range. Does that mean that student's not going to get into Pitzer? No, it doesn't. And I think that 28 still would be fine to submit there, but it's going to be that much stronger if they can push that score up a little bit, get into that 30 to 33 range. That will make them a stronger applicant at that college. And that's why we created this flyer, so that students can put their scores in context to see where they need to be at the schools they are applying to. Now, if we take that 28, or that if the student does push it up to a 30 and look at a few other schools in this list, we could scroll down to say Redlands University. Now, the typical student being admitted there is scoring between 23 and 28. So if you're at that 28, that's great. You're at the high end of the scale. But again, if we just push it up a little bit to a 30, now you're above the typical admitted students range. And that's where that merit-based scholarship money starts to come in, because Redlands will know if you've got a student with a 30, they're going to be applying to other colleges that are similar, but possibly higher ranked. And they know that they often lose if they're just choosing between two universities, all things being equal, and one's ranked higher than the other. I don't believe rankings are the way that students should make their choices when it comes to colleges. You really need to be looking at the specifics of each university and which one is the right fit for you. But at the same time, we've got to acknowledge the reality. A lot of students choose based on rankings. And so a university like Redlands will say, let's offer some more scholarship money to that student with a 30 on the ACT to try to entice them to come here. Let's make their education more affordable, if not outright free. And so you really want to look at this, go through this data once you take that first practice test score and you start to dial in your list of colleges, because it can give you some really concrete scoring goals that will then help you reach your goals for the future. And that's a powerful recipe for students, because if a student goes into this prep process and they think, oh my gosh, I've just got a bunch of extra homework to do, I've got to show up to these online virtual tutoring sessions one-on-one and do some work with teacher John, there's not a lot of internal motivation to go ahead and do that. But if all of a sudden that student knows, oh, if I get this score, I'm likely to get into this college that has this particular program that's going to help me become that person I want to become and go do those things in the world I want to do. Well, now suddenly we've flipped that motivation around. Now, rather than this being a drag for that student to go through, they see directly how it's going to benefit them and their future, and suddenly they're motivated to get in there and do the hard work, not just the work that's assigned to them. Sometimes when students are really motivated, this magical thing happens where they want to do extra work because they see how it's going to benefit them directly to reach their goals for the future. It's a really powerful combination when all those things come together. Now, this was a student question submitted to us, and I think this is a burning question for a lot of families right now. On my mock ACT, I scored 22, which is below the normal range for my target schools. Should I just forget testing and just go that test optional route? We see versions of this question all the time. And what I would say is it depends on where the student is in the process. If you've got a 22 on the ACT and this is senior year and you are filling out your applications and they're due next week and you're applying to schools that are typically seeing scores that are 30 or even higher, that 22 probably won't help in this process. However, we can take that exact same student, and if they're asking this question in the 10th grade or the 11th grade, I would say that's just a starting score. There's no reason you can't move from 22 to 30 on the ACT if you put in the requisite time and energy with the right expert teachers to help you get there. So don't limit your options too early, because one thing that happens if you decide really early to go that test optional route, you're just shrinking the number of schools that are going to be available to you. And we don't want to do that too early because all of this is always liquid. It's always in flux. The major that you're thinking about is often changing throughout high school. The colleges you want to apply to, your number one choice, is often changing right up until the time you submit. Oftentimes, even after you sent your applications off and get offers back from different colleges, it's still changing. So we never want to do anything to limit our options too early in the process. We also don't want to be discouraged by a starting score that's on the lower end of what that student expected. Right? The range of potential improvement is vastly larger than you realize. I have seen miraculous results, whether that's a student who moved from a 17 to a 29 on the ACT, which is a real result, or a student who moved from a 30 to a 36, or anywhere in between. We see incredible results when students are motivated and when they put in the proper time and energy with the right expert teachers who do this for a living to help students improve. Really wonderful things happen. And then as a side benefit for students and for parents, when that process happens, students are picking up skills that will help them for the rest of their lives, because they often think that this is a test. That score is embedded in concrete and it's something that can't be improved. And when we show them empirically that they can improve that score, it's not a teacher that's giving you a higher grade because they really like you. This is a stone cold test that just spits out results. And when that student learns they can improve on that, we have seen students that suddenly understand and realize they can improve on anything they put their heart and soul into, put in the proper time and hard work, and work with the right people. Last point on this, definitely take it one step at a time though. If we take it one step at a time, anything is possible. So that student who sees they have a 22 and they know they need to get up to a 30 to be competitive, let's not swing for the 30 right at the beginning. Let's celebrate our achievements along the way. When we move from a 22 to a 23, fantastic. When we move from a 23 to a 24, we're even more excited. And oftentimes that students say, well, I'm only up 2 points. It's all about getting that ball up over the hump and then rolling downhill. Then suddenly you go, oh, if I do the homework, my scores improve. If I take these extra practice tests, my scores improve. When I listen to these expert teachers, my scores improve. Really wonderful things start to happen. And that's how we eventually get to the promised land of that really high score that seemed impossible to achieve at the beginning. It can really be just incredible, exciting stuff when that starts to happen for parents, for students, and for us as teachers. When it comes to planning out when you're going to take your test, I can't go through every iteration here that's possible for every type of student. What I can do is let you download this flyer and you can examine it and look at it. Let's take a second to look at the standard path versus the accelerated path versus the summers only path and just hit the main highlights of those three options. So with the standard path, we've got students that are going to begin the prep process in fall of 11th grade. Again, you want to do your planning with, whether that's with us or with your counselor, in the summer before 11th grade, so we at least have a plan in place. But if you go this standard route, you would begin some prep the fall of 11th grade. You'd take your first official exam February, April, or June of 11th grade, depending on your schedule. Don't do it when you're in the middle of a varsity sport. Don't do it when you're the lead in the school play. Do it when you have the time and energy to really focus on the preparation part of these exams. Your second one is going to be July or September of 12th grade, and then we'd have a backup third exam that would be later in the fall. My preference for students that get on this early would be this accelerated program, which is doing preparation the summer before 11th grade, whether you're ACT or SAT. And the reason for that is it's going to help prepare you for school in 11th grade. It's going to help prepare you for the PSAT that you're going to take in 11th grade. And that's whether you're doing an ACT program or an SAT program, you're still going to receive those additional benefits. Then if your score looks like if the student is ready to achieve a score that's going to help them, maybe you take an official exam September, October, December of your junior year. If you're not ready, okay, then we just bump over to the standard path. But by starting it early, we have more options open. We keep all of our options open. Then if the student does well in the fall, they can take that second exam February, April, or June of their junior year, and hopefully they're done by the end of the junior year, which is a really wonderful place to be. And then our backup option is July or September of the senior year for that third test, should they need it. What's really nice here is this third option. Those are still done in time for your early applications, which continues to be a bigger and bigger part of this process. And we'll do a whole separate webinar on regular decision versus early application deadlines and how that can help you in this process. But the short answer is that if we can get our testing done before the early applications are due, that's a big bonus in this process. So the accelerated is my preferred path for students that can do that. But the standard is fine as well. And what you really want to do is consult with a professional on which path is going to be best for you. And then finally, the summers only program, there are just certain students that are so impacted during the school year, they can't be bothered with all of this. And for those students, they really should do some work the summer before junior year if they're going to do nothing during the school year, and then do some more work the summer before senior year. So that's really what the summer only program looks like. But again, reach out to us. We're happy to answer an email, answer a phone call, schedule a meeting to help walk you through this process. And that's all completely free to families that want to do that. 12th grade. Okay. We just talked about early applications. So again, they improve your admit rates dramatically. So complete your test prep early if you can. Of course, create a balanced list of colleges. Have some safety schools, have some reach schools, have some right in the middle. Again, you're more likely to earn that merit aid at your safety schools. And then finally, for my 12th graders, I want to remind you, Superscores can be very advantageous. And real quick on this next slide, I have a poll for you regarding that. Who knows what a Superscore is? Or yes or no, do you know what a Superscore is? Okay, so many of us don't know what it is, and I would venture to bet that some students who think they do might not. So let's just unpack that real quick. Johnny takes the ACT in April, scores 32, 29, 32, 28, and a 30 composite on the test. Great score. We're really proud of Johnny. Now, Johnny does some more prep in preparation for September of his senior year, and you can see his English score went up and his reading score went up. He actually performed a little worse on the math and a little worse on the science versus the first time. So he has a 30 composite again, and Johnny's a little disappointed that it's the exact same total score as the last time he took it, especially after all this hard work and prep he put in. That doesn't have to be the end of the story. If Johnny takes these two tests and submits them both to the colleges he's applying to, the majority of schools do what's called superscoring, where they will cherry pick the best subject scores from those two test dates and combine them into a Superscore. So now when they're looking at his file, they see a 35 in English, a 34 in reading, that's from this test date, a 29 in math, a 28 in science, that's from this one, and a 32 composite, a much higher score than he ever scored on any individual test date. Now, along those lines, I want to really encourage students, don't automatically send your scores when you're registering for the exam. That's all optional. You do not need to fill in colleges that you're going to automatically send your scores to. Stay in control of your information. But when you start to look, you get to that point, you log into your account and say, okay, what scores am I going to send to what colleges? Examine to see if you would qualify for a Superscore. If you do, submit both tests to those colleges you're applying to, because not every college that does Superscore states it explicitly on their website. And you always want to give them the opportunity to Superscore your test. And yes, this does apply to ACT and to SAT. Now, I do want to take a brief moment to talk about our equity pledge, because equity in this process is really important to me as the CEO of this company and everyone who works here at Test Prep Gurus. The biggest problem in test prep today is equity. It's that students who can't afford test preparation, especially expert test preparation, they're at a major disadvantage to the families that can afford it. And that makes it feel like the process isn't fair. Well, we at Test Prep Gurus want to solve this issue. And I believe we've figured out a way to do that. So just like Tom's shoes, for every family that enrolls in a Test Prep Gurus one-on-one program or in one of our classroom programs, we're going to donate a seat in one of our classroom programs completely for free to a student in need. So every time a family signs up for one of our programs, they can feel good about the fact that they're not creating an unfair advantage for their student, that this is a very fair process, because our goal is nothing short of every student in need in America should be able to take one of our free classes, and we look forward to achieving that with you. All right, closing words here for students, for parents. The SAT and ACT are not assessments. Thinking of that way will not help you to achieve your goals. They are opportunities. Opportunities to win scholarships, opportunities to gain access to selective colleges, and opportunities to build skills for the future. That, thinking of them, framing the test in that way, that's a recipe for success. So in closing this out, if anyone wants the slides from this presentation, if you want a mock test, if you want free updates on college admissions, click that link there below, reach out to us, let us know how we can help. That's what we're here for. That's why we're in this line of work, is to help students reach their goals. And we can't wait to have the opportunity to help you reach your goals as a family for your students' future. All right. I'm Nick Stanley. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see all of you soon. Thank you, and goodbye.